Hey, everybody. I hope you're doing well today. Well, let's take a look at fiscal policy and evaluating its strengths and weaknesses. Well, the first strength of fiscal policy, which of course is the government's ability to extract taxes from people and or spend money through its own government financed spending projects, has some strengths. Okay, so the first strength of fiscal policy is that it can very quickly pull an economy out of recession. And this was based on actually the entire Keynesian idea of government spending their way out of recession. It's almost counterintuitive, the larger the recession, the lower the incomes of people, the less income that the government's going to have through taxation. But what Keynes said is that governments really need to expand their fiscal policies to form and to increase government spending and actually maybe even cut taxes. So like do the counterintuitive thing, spend more and cut taxes, and this would stimulate aggregate demand to recover back to previous levels. So fiscal policy is a good way for the government to get itself out of a recession. Secondly, fiscal policy is a good way of dealing with rapid and escalating inflation. Inflationary pressures arising when there is an inflationary gap can sometimes get out of hand. And contractionary fiscal policy may be used to effectively bring the problem under control. If you hear what all of this is saying, by the way, the strengths of fiscal policy, is that fiscal policy can have a direct impact on aggregate demand. And most of that is through the government deciding if it's either going to expand its spending or contract its spending, because, of course, government spending is one of the components of aggregate demand. The other thing, or other strength of fiscal policy, is the ability to target certain sectors of the economy. And these would be things that you would want your government to focus on, like healthcare, like education, like particular infrastructure projects like airports and roads and hospitals, making sure that the economy has the ability to function well and increase the ability for trade. And so fiscal policy is good at doing that, of course, because the government is actually doing it and improving the physical capital of a place. Of course, targeting sectors of the economy would also mean other merit goods, a variety of public goods, whether it's police force or parks and so on, with various types of government spending. So they can target sectors through government spending. And this is a strength of fiscal policy. The fourth thing is direct impact of government spending on aggregate demand. And I think this is fairly obvious. Changes in government spending impact directly on aggregate demand. And obviously this can be super helpful to policymakers who want to be as responsive as possible to any sort of downturns in the economy. And changes in taxes, yeah, those work, but there's a time lag usually concerned with taxes. But government spending, no problem. That can have an immediate impact on aggregate demand. And last thing is the ability to affect potential output. And fiscal policy can affect potential output and long-term economic growth indirectly and directly, actually, through the investments in human and physical capital, or human capital, education and healthcare, fiscal capital, things like infrastructure. And also they can use fiscal policy to give incentives to firms to invest. Anytime the government is spending, the firms know that the economy is going to improve. And that stimulates their own investment oftentimes. Okay, so those are the strengths of fiscal policy: pulling an economy out of recession, dealing with rapid and escalating inflation, the ability to target sectors of the economy, and direct impact of government spending on aggregate demand, and the ability to affect potential output. So now let's take a look at the weaknesses of fiscal policy. And the first one is really the problem of time lags. And economists and government officials know this. But it takes a while for fiscal policies to kick in. And that could be a problem because the recession could continue, or there might be some sort of inflationary gap. And it's also difficult for governments to figure out what the appropriate policy is to deal with the problem, because really it's kind of difficult to figure out sometimes what the problem is in the economy before it might be too late. So many months can pass before maybe even the government's aware of a downturn in the economy, and then how do they fix it? They're usually not necessarily dealing with that much clarity in the exact problems of the economy, and it takes time to figure those things out. So that's just sort of a logistical deal. The other thing is political constraints. I mean, government spending and taxation faces a lot of pressure and numerous unrelated things to fiscal policy. You know, spending on social services and public goods like healthcare and education is undertaken for its own sake and isn't necessarily something you can sacrifice for contractionary fiscal policy. And tax increases are politically unpopular. I mean, the very thing that you would want to do in a recession is raise taxes so that you have more money in order to provide maybe basic services. But there is nobody who's interested in raising taxes when there's a particular recession. In fact, oftentimes they cut taxes, which is actually cuts government revenue. I mean, recession causes budget deficits, and then to cut taxes even more is like putting yourself more in debt, but you can't exactly raise taxes on people when they're losing their jobs or they're uncertain about the economic environment. The next thing is crowding out, and we covered this in another video, but crowding out is this idea that as the government demands more money, borrows more money, it actually will increase interest rates, and that will decrease private spending. And so the whole expansionary fiscal policy can get sort of crowded out by the fact that because the government is spending more, that'll drive interest rates up, which will be a disincentive for businesses and firms to invest in the economy, and therefore there'll actually be no change in aggregate demand. The next thing is the inability of fiscal policy to deal with supply-side causes of instability. If the instability is caused by supply-side factors, leading maybe to like stagflation or something, where GDP is falling, fiscal policy is unable to deal with this because it really would require a contractionary fiscal policy and to fix it. But what the recession actually oftentimes, and Keynes proved this, is it needs an expansionary fiscal policy in order to get yourself out of the recession. So if the problem is inflation, it makes it really difficult during a recession for contractionary fiscal policy to do so. And so it's kind of caught in the middle. And so if there's a supply side problem, fiscal policy doesn't really deal with supply side, it deals with the demand side. Next up, in a recession, tax cuts may not be very effective in increasing aggregate demand. You know, if you're not feeling good about the economy and you get a tax cut, okay, tax cuts also take time to actually be implemented, maybe half a year, even a year. And then people don't really feel necessarily the total tax cut until later. So if you got a 10% tax cut and you made, say, $50,000 a year, and all of a sudden you get another $5,000 in your pocket, well, that sounds good. And a 10% tax cut's huge, but that sounds good. You got another $5,000 in your pocket, but you don't really, because that $5,000 that you're going to earn is going to be spread out over 12 months, because most people get paid monthly or bi-monthly. But every month, that's only $600 more. That's a lot, but that's not exactly like you're just going to all of a sudden go spend it, especially if you're not even sure you're going to have a job. So tax cuts may not be very effective. And then the last thing is a weakness of fiscal policy is the inability to really fine-tune the economy. And all this means is that fiscal policy isn't very accurate. And while it can affect like overall aggregate demand, whether it goes up or down through government spending or tax cuts or whatnot, it's not very good at like precision targeting to hit a particular level of output or a particular level of employment or a particular level, particular price level. So it's a little bit clunky in its ability to be precise in the way in which it can fix or help manage an economy. Okay, so there you go. You got the strengths of fiscal policy, the weaknesses of fiscal policy, and I hope you found this video to be helpful, and we'll talk to you in a bit.